By the time this tornado touched the ground, 4 other monsters had already torn across the South that same day. The hospitals were full. The morgues were overwhelmed. Entire towns had already been wiped off the map. And the people of Northeast Alabama, watching the horror unfold on whatever television still had power, believed the worst was finally behind them. The sun was even starting to come out. It was early evening. Surely it was over. It was not over. What was about to drop out of the sky over DeKalb County, Alabama, was the 4th and final EF5 tornado of the single most violent tornado day in American history. And in many ways, it would be the cruelest of them all, because it came at the end, when everyone was already exhausted, already grieving, already certain that lightning could not possibly strike the same region twice in one afternoon. This is the story of the Rainsville tornado. A storm so powerful it tore an 800-pound safe out of a home and hurled it the length of 2 football fields. A storm that stripped a school bus down to its bare metal frame and threw it across a highway. And a storm that, in one unforgettable moment, was photographed by a father who had just climbed out of the rubble of his own destroyed house, still not knowing if his family was alive. Stay with me, because to understand how this tornado happened, you have to understand that it was not really a separate storm at all. It was the same monster that had already been killing people for hours. Let's go back to the beginning of that day. April 27th, 2011. For days, the National Weather Service and the Storm Prediction Center had been warning that something historic was coming. The atmosphere setting up across the Deep South was, in the words of the scientists who studied it, among the most favorable conditions for violent, long-track tornadoes ever documented. Every ingredient was maxed out. Warm, soaking wet air came surging north from the Gulf of Mexico. High above it, the jet stream screamed across the region, and the winds twisted and accelerated with height, giving any storm that formed the spin it needed to become a killer. The Storm Prediction Center raised a high risk, the rarest and most serious alarm they issue, the one reserved for days they truly believe will cost lives. And the day delivered on that fear almost immediately. There were actually 2 rounds of storms. A first wave rolled through in the early morning, and while it didn't produce the worst tornadoes, it did something nearly as deadly. It knocked out power and communications across enormous stretches of Alabama and Mississippi. So before the truly catastrophic storms had even formed, countless people had already lost their television, their internet, sometimes their phone service. Their lifeline to any warning was already cut. Hold on to that, because it matters all the way to the end. Then, in the early afternoon, the atmosphere recovered and loaded itself for the main event. And around 1:45 in the afternoon, near Harperville, Mississippi, a single supercell thunderstorm formed that would go on to become one of the most prolific killers in the entire outbreak. This one storm did not produce just one tornado. It was a tornado factory. As it churned northeast, it first dropped a violent EF5 tornado in Mississippi. Then, still alive and still rotating, the same parent storm crossed into Alabama and produced a long-track EF4 that carved across the central part of the state. And even that was not the end of it. This relentless supercell kept moving, kept feeding on the unstable air, and by around 5:45 in the evening, it began to re-intensify as it approached the northeastern corner of Alabama, over DeKalb County. The people there had spent the entire day hearing about the devastation elsewhere. Now the same storm system that had been killing all day was turning its attention to them. At first, the local warning was only for a severe thunderstorm, but forecasters were watching the radar with growing dread. At 6:10 in the evening, a tornado warning was issued for the Lakeview community and the surrounding areas. 9 minutes later, at approximately 6:19, just northeast of Geraldine, the tornado touched down. It did not start as a monster. In the Lakeview area, the early damage was relatively modest. Snapped trees, structural damage to smaller buildings. The tornado tracked northeast, running roughly parallel to State Route 75, heading straight toward the town of Fife. And as it went, it began to transform. Near Fife, Witnesses watched the tornado shift and writhe, sometimes appearing as thin, snaking subvortices, sometimes consolidating into a single solid wedge. This is the signature of a multiple vortex tornado, where smaller, even more intense whirlwinds spin inside the larger circulation. The damage at Fife grew more significant. Trees around the Beulah Baptist Cemetery were snapped clean off. Homes were torn apart. And there is a chilling detail from this moment in the storm's life. A 911 dispatcher in the area later remembered the radio call that came in from a Fife police officer who had eyes on the tornado. The officer's voice came across the radio saying this thing had become massive, that it was huge, and that it was heading into Rainsville. That was when the people coordinating the emergency response knew, in their gut, that something terrible was about to happen. They just had no idea how terrible. Because past Fife, this tornado did something that takes it out of the realm of an ordinary natural disaster and into the realm of pure physics-defying violence. Picture what those final minutes were like on the ground. The light had gone a deep, bruised green. The color the sky turns when a storm is carrying an enormous amount of hail and debris high in its core. The rain was coming sideways, and over the roar of the wind, survivors describe a sound that doesn't leave you. A continuous, grinding freight train howl that seems to come from everywhere at once and grows louder by the second. For the families in its path, there was no dramatic funnel slowly approaching across an open field. There was a wall of churning blackness, almost no warning, and then their world coming apart. It exploded in size and strength. Near a place along the path called Shiloh and Heaton Road, the tornado grew dramatically wider, and for the first time, reached EF5 intensity, the absolute maximum on the scale, with estimated winds well over 200 miles an hour. A metal farm building was completely obliterated. Homes were swept away. The ground itself was scoured, the grass and topsoil torn away to leave bare earth. And then, just southeast of Rainsville, the tornado widened to a full half-mile across and slammed into the town at the peak of its fury. What happened in Rainsville is almost impossible to put into words, so let the evidence speak. Numerous homes, businesses, and public buildings were not just destroyed, they were decimated, with little to no debris left behind. When a tornado leaves a clean concrete slab where a solid house used to stand, scattering the remains a mile downwind, that is the fingerprint of an EF5. And in Rainsville, that fingerprint was everywhere. Investigators specifically noted homes that had been anchored to their foundations with bolts and straps, built exactly the way they should be, simply gone. The vehicles tell the same impossible story. Cars were lofted hundreds of yards through the air and mangled beyond any recognition. A school bus was thrown across a highway and stripped down to nothing but its bare chassis, the metal skeleton of a bus and nothing else. A Huddle House restaurant was hit with such force that its metal frame was twisted and distorted, with only a single wall left standing. But the detail that meteorologists and weather enthusiasts still talk about today, the one that captures the raw, almost unbelievable power of this storm, is the safe. At one home that suffered EF5 damage, an 800-pound safe, a safe that weighed nearly half a ton, was ripped from its anchorage and thrown more than 600 feet over the length of 2 football fields into a wooded area. And when they found it, the door had been torn completely off. Think about the force that requires. Nearly half a ton, anchored down, picked up and thrown the length of 2 football fields and ripped open in the process. The town's own institutions were gutted. Plainview High School took $10 to $15 million in damage to its main buildings, its gyms, its cafeteria, its sports fields, and the DeKalb County Schools Coliseum. Pavement was scoured off of several roads, the asphalt itself peeled away by the wind. One Alabama state representative who saw the aftermath said it looked like a war-torn country, with vehicles flipped upside down and half of a bus sitting across the road. Images, he said, that would stay in his mind for the rest of his life. And it is here, in the middle of this unimaginable destruction, that we get the single most haunting human moment of the entire event. As the tornado passed directly over the home of the Thompson family, it did to their house what it did to so many others. It tore it apart around them. But somehow, the family survived. And in the seconds right after the tornado passed, the father, George Thompson, rose up out of the rubble of his own destroyed home, pulled out his phone, and took a photograph of the tornado as it moved away from him, still churning, still massive, still grinding toward the next town. A man standing in the wreckage of everything he owned, documenting the monster that had just nearly killed his family. That photograph exists because, by some miracle, he lived to take it. Many of his neighbors did not. Across DeKalb County, the human toll was staggering. The Rainsville tornado itself is officially blamed for around 25 deaths along its path. But the larger picture is even darker. When you count all the storms that struck DeKalb County across that entire terrible day, the county lost dozens of its people. More than 30 souls in a single afternoon and evening. Among the victims in the Rainsville area were the elderly and the very young. The names etched into the county's memorial include 3-year-old Hannah Goins and 6-year-old Emma Ferguson, children whose lives had barely begun. Entire families were taken together. The dead ranged from small children to people in their 80s and 90s. The tornado was not finished even after it ravaged Rainsville. It continued northeast through the Sylvania area and toward Hennegar, still carrying violent intensity, before finally crossing into Georgia and dissipating near Rising Fawn. In total, it had been on the ground for about 36 minutes and traveled nearly 37 miles. 36 minutes of terror that rewrote the map of an entire county. When the winds finally died, the survivors faced a new nightmare. In the dark, with the power gone and roads buried under debris and downed trees, neighbors began clawing through the wreckage of homes looking for the missing. The sheriff who responded that night later said there were houses simply gone, places where you would never have known a house had stood at all. People were missing for days. He described driving through areas where he had grown up and not recognizing a single landmark. The roads, the buildings, the scenery he had known his whole life. All of it erased. The most critically injured, including children, had to be rushed more than an hour away to the Children's Hospital in Birmingham because the local capacity to treat them had been shattered, along with everything else. And remember, this was the same supercell that had started its life back in Mississippi hours earlier. From that one storm came an EF5 in Mississippi, an EF4 across central Alabama, this EF5 in Rainsville, and even after this, the same system would go on to produce a destructive tornado that hammered Ringgold, Georgia. One parent storm, a trail of dead towns stretching across multiple states. It is one of the most violent and prolific single supercells ever documented. When the surveys were complete, the Rainsville tornado was confirmed as an EF5, the fourth of the day, and to this day, it remains the most recent EF5 tornado on record in the state of Alabama. 4 EF5 tornadoes in a single 24-hour period. To put that in perspective, in a normal year, the entire United States might see 1 EF5, or none at all. On April 27, 2011, there were 4, and Rainsville was the last. So why does this one matter so much, beyond the staggering numbers? Because Rainsville is the proof of something that should frighten and humble all of us. These were not careless people. They had warnings, even if many had lost power. They had a community that looked out for one another. Many of them did everything right, took shelter in interior rooms, hunkered down in the safest place their homes had to offer. And against an EF5, against winds that can throw a half-ton safe the length of 2 football fields and peel asphalt off the road, it was simply not enough. Some forces are beyond what any ordinary home, any closet, any hallway can withstand. The people who survived Rainsville learned that the only true protection against the most violent tornadoes on Earth is to already be below ground, in a shelter engineered to take a direct hit before the storm ever arrives. After 2011, that lesson reshaped how this part of the country prepares. Storm shelters and engineered safe rooms spread across DeKalb County. The emergency manager who lived through that night made it his life's mission to get every family a plan and a place to go, refusing to let the dead have died in vain. And maybe that is the truest legacy of the Rainsville tornado. Not the safe thrown 600 feet, not the bus stripped to its frame, not even the unforgettable photograph of a father rising from the ruins of his home, but the simple, hard-won understanding that when the sky turns that shade of green and the sirens begin to wail, the warning is real, the danger is real, and the few minutes you have to get to true shelter may be the most important minutes of your entire life. The people of Rainsville paid for that lesson with everything they had. The least the rest of us can do is learn it.